really fast. Kieran, Gabriella, Abdul, Mark, Mohammed, Colette, Timo, Cosmo, Taisha, Jordan, Brian, Chris, Anthony, Jack. All right, you're all here. Okay, so we talked about the Spartan system put in place supposedly by this guy by the name of Lycurgus, right? With the intent of making sure that Sparta maintained military superiority. And why did Sparta need to maintain military superiority? What was the reason for that, Anthony?
What do you call it? The slaves? They were afraid of the slaves.
Okay.
Slave revolt.
Right, but not slaves. Similar, but not exactly the same. Remember what they were called? Sure. The Helots. So very close, but the only reason that we kind of make this distinction is that there's also going to be enslaved peoples in ancient Greece, and we're going to talk about both in kind of slightly different statuses. But yes, to maintain dominance over the Helots, right? Because they are relying on their land and the Helots to kind of farm and get produce from that land. Okay, so a little bit about the Spartan government here. Now, one of the kind of hallmarks of the Archaic period was that the Greek city-states were getting rid of their kings. I don't know if you remember this, because it was like forever ago, despite only being 2 classes ago, right? Something that's happening across the Greek world is they're getting rid of kings, replacing them with oligarchies. Sparta is going to be unusual in that it keeps its kings, and kings plural, because somehow Sparta ended up with 2 kings. So there were 2 royal lines, 2 different families, right? Where the eldest son would inherit the kingship from his father, in theory, right? Or oldest male relative. So this is what we mean by hereditary succession. So the Spartan kings were the chief executive officers, essentially. Obviously, it's a lifetime appointment. And the way it worked is that they would split their duties, so that one would always be focused on foreign and military affairs, the other would always be focused on domestic affairs. And the one who was focused on domestic affairs always had to remain in the city of Sparta. So went the rule, right? But what the Spartans do is essentially develop some, we might say, checks and balances, so to speak, so that the kings are not going to be absolute monarchs, but again, executive officers, and there's going to be these other kind of bodies that are going to both kind of be conducting oversight and doing their own business. So they had the Gerousia, which just basically means group of old men, literal translation, or a council of elders, made up of 28 Spartan men over the age of 60, which is, again, when you're in a highly militaristic society fighting a lot, getting over 60 is an achievement. So they had some sort of legislative and judicial duties, some lawmaking, judging cases, but we really don't have a good idea of what this actually looked like. Then they also had ephors. So these would be 5 men. They would be elected for an annual office, right? So they would hold the office of ephor for a year, and they were supposed to oversee all of this, make sure everything was working properly, as well as the Spartan education system, the training of young Spartans. Then lastly, there was a popular assembly where all Spartan citizens, male citizens, would meet. Again, not quite sure what its exact kind of government function is. The Greeks constructed a name to describe Sparta. They called Sparta a mixed constitution because it was a mix of kind of the 3 main types of governments that the Greeks acknowledged. It was a monarchy, there were kings. It was an oligarchy because there was this kind of oligarchic council, and it was a democracy because it had this kind of popular assembly. And so the Greeks said, well, it has all 3 elements. It's an example of a mixed constitution. Don't know what to do with it with Sparta, but that term will become especially important a little bit later on when we talk about Rome. Despite this, largely because it's opposition to Athens, Sparta gets typified primarily as an oligarchy, which is kind of weird because there was kind of an equality among Spartan citizens. Nonetheless, because of its control over Messenia, and as I mentioned, opposition to Athens, it tends to get lumped in with oligarchic governments. Okay, so foreign affairs. In the 500s, right, so 6th century BCE, Sparta starts to get really involved in kind of the politics of other city-states, right? So they start inserting themselves into local business, right? Their stated reason, right, is that they are supporting, quote unquote, constitutional governments, and thus this is the right thing to do, and so they were obligated to stand up for constitutional governments. What this is really about, right, is they're concerned about kind of the populism that is attached to tyranny and what it might do to Sparta. So it's very much an anti-tyrant foreign policy, hence an anti-populist foreign policy. So why are the Spartans kind of concerned about populism, do you think? This idea of the people kind of taking on more power for themselves. Right, Jordan?
The Helots to get
Again, goes back to the Helots, right, the Messenians, and afraid that they are, again, somehow going to acquire too much power. So, in their fight against tyranny, right, they basically promote oligarchic forms of government. They become kind of the oligarchic champion, and that becomes a hallmark of their foreign policy. So, Sparta, if you remember, down here, right, part of the Peloponnesus, this big southern part of Greece, right? So Sparta is basically going to form, and by form basically I mean strongly encourage other Greek city-states in the Peloponnesus to kind of join. By strongly encourage, I mean threaten, right? The Peloponnesian League. So that all of the city-states here in the Peloponnesus agree that they will all have the same friends and enemies as one another. And they all agree that they're going to follow Sparta's leadership in these matters, right? So here we get kind of a big alliance, right? A political bloc that is really, kind of following Sparta's lead to a certain extent under Spartan authority. Okay, Jordan.
The other members of the Peloponnesian League weren't like independent fully though, right?
Technically, they were. So, all right, so here you have Laconia, right? So you've got Sparta. Sparta takes over the other people kind of in this region here who are the Perioikoi, those living around Sparta who are free, slightly lower status than your Spartans, right? Then they also directly control the Messenians. These the blue and green sections up here are technically politically independent, okay? They are technically voluntary members of this self-defense alliance. And they technically voluntary say, well, because Sparta, you're really strong, we're gonna give you the kind of main voice. That's technically. The reason I'm saying technically, again, is because there's some threatening, or implied threatening that's going on, and people recognize that Sparta holds the power here in the region. But technically speaking, they are independent. Okay. Good, Sparta? Any last questions about archaic Sparta? Which the answer will probably be, I don't know, but no one knows. All good? Okay. All right, so then we move on to our other archaic city-state, Athens. Okay? Now, Athens is actually going to be, especially at the beginning part here, a very unimportant polis during the archaic period, right? Athens is very much a minor league player. The only reason kind of we know as much about Athens as we do is because of what Athens becomes later, right? But part of the archaic period is seeing kind of where classical Athens, kind of the next period, where it comes from, right? Okay, so let's talk about Athens in the archaic period. All right, so again, a little bit about geography, right? You've got the city-state of Athens, right? And it is located in the region called Attica, right? And so again, Attica, Athens sometimes gets used almost interchangeably, right? But Athens is kind of the city-state center, Attica is the wider region. And again, Athens will basically, the way to describe it is that the city-state itself, right, encompasses most of Attica, right? Especially the southern part of Attica, the people that live there are Athenian citizens. Now, during the Archaic period, Athens, like other Greek city-states, like most other ones, was an oligarchy, meaning that it was ruled by a small group of individuals based on wealth, right? The richest citizens were the ones in charge. So out of this body of elite wealthy citizens, each year 3 archons would be elected. And these 3 archons would be essentially kind of the executive officers. They would serve for a year, right? And again, as I mentioned, you had to have lots of money in order to be eligible for this office. Eventually down the road, it's going to be, the number of archons is going to increase. Eventually the Athenians are going to get to 9 elected for an annual term, right? So they would be executive officers in charge of the day-to-day business. There was also called the Areopagus Council, right? So named because it met on the hill of Ares, right? Which is what Areopagus means. So this was kind of, again, a kind of council of elders. Basically, after you served as archon, you were eligible then to serve on the Areopagus Council. They would advise the archons. They also had important kind of judicial duties. Then there was the popular assembly, right? In theory, every Athenian citizen, adult male, was allowed to attend, but we're not quite sure what the popular assembly did or what it looked like during this time period. So we know it existed, but not quite what its deal was. Okay? But again, the power is going to be in the hands of the wealthy elite. Okay, so there's 2 really formative events that take place in the early Archaic period in Athens. The first, the conspiracy of Chilon, or Cylon. So Chilon was a famous Athenian. He was an Olympic champion, won lots of accolades, was well known around the city. He decided one day he was going to make himself tyrant. And again, this fits the model for the Archaic period, right? Aspiring tyrants tended to be successful public figures. He gathers together a lot of popular support and seizes the Acropolis, kind of the main fortified center of Athens, the spiritual heart of Athens. So he and his supporters basically by force take control of this. He's also getting assistance from his father-in-law, right? A guy by the name of Theogenes, who is the tyrant of another city of Megaron. Remember, tyrants like helping other tyrants, right? However, Chilon is not going to be successful. The big X factor seems to be that he's not able to win over the kind of, we might think of as being middle-class citizen hoplites. So people who are kind of rich enough to be soldiers, but not members of the oligarchic elite. That they stayed loyal to the oligarchic government, didn't support Chilon. So, no luck being tyrant. But he still holds the Acropolis. And the Athenian authorities, led by the archon Megacles, don't see an easy way to dislodge him. So they come to an agreement. Megacles swears that if Chilon and his compatriots, if they basically surrender their arms, give up the Acropolis, they'll be allowed to go into exile. The agreement is struck. However, as soon as they kind of leave the Acropolis, Megacles has them all executed, has them all killed. This will be an important event, not necessarily for what happened, but because it existed. This will make more sense going on, right? So, Megacles was a member of a family, an important oligarchic family known as the Alcmaeonids, which basically just means the family of Alcmaeon, right? who was his father. Because Megacles had sworn to set them free, but killed them instead, he had violated an oath, something that had been sworn under the auspices of the Greek gods. As a result, he was declared, probably by his political enemies, he and his family were declared to be cursed, right? That by violating this oath, they had brought the anger of the gods upon them, and they could not remain in Athens. So, Megacles and his entire extended family were forced from the city to go into exile. Moreover, to show that they meant it, right? The Athenians dug up all the bodies of Megacles' ancestors and threw them outside of the city limits as well too, to remove the cursed Alcmeonids from the city of Athens. Okay, as the story goes, it will become important later on. Soon after, right, we get an oligarch by the name of Draco, again from one of these oligarchic powers. He is empowered, oligarchic families, he is empowered to write down the Athenian laws. Up until this point, the Athenian laws had been kind of oral or passed down by custom. They hadn't been written, right? Draco was going to write down and post the laws. Okay? So this was a big moment. The only law of his that survives is his law on homicide, right? All of his other laws are not going to survive because they get basically replaced, right? This law is important because for the first time, the Athenian state claims to be the sole arbiter of justice. In other words, right, I used to have the option that if someone killed my brother, I could go out and seek justice by killing them, or killing their brother, or someone like that, right? With Draco's law on homicide, which again, the penalty for homicide was death, it was written in that it was the state that had the authority to kind of make this decision and impose this punishment. Okay. Now, his other laws, which don't survive, we don't know exactly what they are, we do know they had a reputation for being very severe, and that death was a common penalty, especially for lesser offenses. So this is why if you hear the word today draconian, if we say something is draconian, meaning that it's like overly severe, it's kind of, kind of going back to these laws of Draco. Okay, so we don't know a lot about these details, but they tell us something important, or at least suggest something important. The fact that you've got not wholly unsuccessful attempt to become tyrant, right? The expulsion of the Alcmeonids, a decision to actually kind of write down the laws, and the laws are very severe, right? That there's probably tension and unrest taking place in Athens at this time, possibly due to inequalities, right? Because again, the supporters of Chilon seem to have been the poorer Athenian citizens. Okay? But again, we don't know a lot about the 7th century. These are pretty much the two big events that we know about. That's right. There's the Athenian Acropolis. That's what Chilon fortified. Which brings us to Solon. So this is going to be a watershed moment in Athenian history. The year 594. Solon is kind of appointed, we're not quite sure by who, but is appointed to be sole archon. If you remember, normally there were 3. This one year, it's just going to be Solon, and he is empowered to do whatever it takes to fix Athens, right? So they're like, you can basically do anything, enact anything, make all the changes you want, right, in order to fix Athens. So he's given kind of sole power, and he's given what appears to be almost limitless power or authority. Okay? Once again, why does something like this happen? Probably there was trouble going on, right? Like, people don't say, okay, you're gonna be the only guy in charge, you can do whatever it takes to fix it, unless it's a pretty serious situation. All right, so we turn now to our first primary source, which is PS7. So we're lucky that Solon basically did a bunch of stuff, which we'll talk about, and then wrote about what he did in poems. And his poems were apparently pretty popular, right? So kind of celebrating the acts that he did as Archon in the year 584. Unfortunately, only some fragments survive, so we only have some scraps of his poetry. But again, they can be useful for telling us a little bit about what was going on in Athens during this time period. So the big one we have, right, which is called Fragment 4, right? And this is the bulk of the reading. So what I'd like you to do is we're going to take 3 to 5 minutes. I'd like you to review Fragment 4. And I want you to identify a problem in Athens that Solon addressed, and make sure to mark your evidence from this poem of that problem. Right? So identify a problem in Athens and mark the evidence, mark the line or the phrase that's your evidence for that problem. Okay? Okay, 1 more minute. So again, identify a problem facing Athens and mark the evidence in this poem for that problem.
question.
Thank you. Okay, so what is a problem facing Athens that Solon had to face? How about Mohammed?
I would say materialism and arrogance, and the leader is going too far with it to the point where he's using force to take people's wealth.
Okay, where's the evidence for that? Or for
Evidence
one?
is in fragment 4, the second sentence. It says, but it is the citizens themselves who by their acts of foolishness and subservience to money are willing to destroy a great city. And the mind of the people's leaders is unjust. And in the next sentence, he goes on to say that they grow wealthy, yielding to unjust deeds, sparing neither sacred nor private property. They steal with rapaciousness, one from one source, one from another, and they have no regard for the august foundations of justice.
Okay. Briar, what did you have?
Fragments in this is now coming upon the whole city as an escapable leader, and the city has quickly broached wretched slavery, which arouses civil strife and slumbering war.
Okay, so what's the problem?
The problem is that slavery and the way it manifested causes civil unrest, and people question government authority over people's lives.
Okay. All right. So we've got kind of greed and unjust leaders that seems to be leading to a practice of slavery and strife, unrest, right? Slumbering war, he describes it as, right? So pretty serious unrest.
Slumbering war meaning like war that was committed.
Yeah. Right. So it's kind of like civil strife, you know, kind of inching up towards outright, you know, civil war. Right. All right. What else? What's another problem? Right?
Another problem that is facing Athens kind of also be according to Solon, kind of would be lawlessness. As I've seen where the Rose starts to see the whole people of Athens they're going to a foreign land, sold down with feathers. You know, so much so that and also encountered so much so that the evil comes home to each man, and the courtyard needs to have no longer the will to hold it back.
Okay, so that I think so you're right about lawlessness, and you're right about the quote, but the quote isn't really about lawlessness, though. So you've got two right things there, but we want to match them up a little bit. So let's start with this quote first that Brian mentioned, right? So this kind of comes out of the quote that Brian just talked about at the end of page 1, moving into page 2, right? So he talks about kind of the civil strife, the slumbering war, the loss of many of their lovely youth. For at the hands of its enemies, the much-loved city is being swiftly worn down amid conspiracies dear to the unjust. These are the evils that are rife among the people, and many of the poor are going to a foreign land, sold and bound in shameful fetters. So it's not lawlessness exactly here, but what's the problem that he's identifying? Or problems, maybe. Right?
Not literal lawlessness, but people becoming so fed up with the laws that rule over them that they're on the brink of it.
Not quite here. So again, there is going to be lawlessness, but here it's the enemies being worn down. Its enemies of the much-loved city is being swiftly worn down. The city is being worn down amid conspiracies dear to the unjust. Many of the poor are going to a foreign land, sold and bound in shameful slavery. So the city is being worn down because of this strife, these conspiracies, the things that the unjust are doing. Right? And what is happening to people because of this?
They're leaving the city or being sold into slavery.
There we go. They're leaving the city, but not Here he's being a little poetic. Not out of their own free will. It's not free will. It's like, not I'm going somewhere else, right? But they're being sold and bound. That people are being enslaved, Athenians are being enslaved and sold out of the city. So that's a problem. Technically not illegal. It doesn't say this at this point. I'll tell you that. Technically not illegal, but it's a problem for Solon, right? Because it's destroying the city. Okay, what else? Where do we see lawlessness then? He does talk about lawlessness being a problem. Where do we see evidence of that here in the poem? Nicolette.
That they have no regard for the foundation of justice.
Who's they?
Well, I'm going to assume that they meant the Helots.
Helots are in Sparta.
Well, I'm going to assume, I can't remember their term for it, but not slaves necessarily.
No, Solon here is it's not enslaved people that are the problem themselves. Like they are the way people are being enslaved is a problem, but they're not the perpetrators. How about Anthony?
The leaders?
The leaders. Who are the leaders of Athens at this time?
The archons.
The archons, and maybe more broadly, what? The wealthy, right? The oligarchs, the oligarchic class, the Athenian elites, of which Solon is one, right? Remember, Solon is sole archon in 594. But what's he saying about the oligarchic elites, or at least some of them? How are they behaving? Jordan?
They're being so enticed by like the money from slavery and all that other stuff that they're starting to act out.
Right, so they are motivated by greed, right? And that they're acting out, but what are they doing because of their greed?
But they're also yielding to unjust deeds.
Right?
Like going against going against the state laws and the policies.
So here, this is the problem. You can't know this. They're not going against the laws yet, but Solon says they're still acting in an unjust way. Right? So in fact, some of what is allowed isn't actually just.
So
Is
like
part of
morally
Solon's
gray?
problem. What?
So like morally gray, like they're in the gray area. So they're
No, I mean Solon would say not morally gray. He would say morally bad, but legally okay. If that makes sense.
It makes sense.
This will become a little bit clearer maybe when we explain it. Anthony, you have something?
Weren't they also offending the gods? It talks about like sacred property in the text.
Yes, right. That they were so greedy that they were not just stealing from humans; they were stealing from the gods. Nicolette?
No, is that why they thought like bad things were happening to their land because they would be facing the gods?
I mean, there's always a little bit of that under the surface, but really this is more about human greed and the problems that the leaders of Athens are bringing because of it. I mean, so I don't want to say that doesn't factor into it, but Solon is really focusing on what the people are doing. Right.
Also, how greatly did types of slavery vary in Athens? Because you know that there were multitudes of slavery, like there was wage slavery and then there was child slavery. Did the people of Athens rebel against certain types of slavery or just slavery altogether?
Hold that thought. No, that's a great question, and you're right. We'll come back to that in a second. So it's a really good question. Right?
I'm just checking.
Okay. All right. The lawlessness, right? He talks at the end, right? He says, "This is what my heart bids me to teach the Athenians. That lawlessness, right? That again is coming out of this greed, brings the city countless ills. But lawfulness, the opposite, right? Behaving in a lawful or just manner, reveals all that is orderly, fitting, yada yada yada." And what a great opening! What a great opening to the poem, right? He says, "Our state will never perish through the dispensation of Zeus or the intentions of the blessed gods. For such a stout-hearted guardian, Pallas Athena, born of a mighty father, holds her hand over it." What's he saying in this first line?
That Athens would never die because the god is watching over city, Athena.
Which is being poetic, right? But again, Athens is never going to be kind of destroyed by outside forces or the world kind of the world operating as the world does. Specifically the gods, but he's being a little bit poetic, right?
Sorry, I'm sorry, but isn't it more like he's trying to say that Athens will cease to exist is from the gods start coming from within?
Right. The very next line, right? But it is the citizens themselves who by their acts of foolishness and subservience to money are willing to destroy a great city, right? That Athens will never be destroyed by the outside, by outside factors. What's the only way Athens can be destroyed?
Inside.
From the inside, by the Athenians acting in this unjust manner, right? Okay, so again, unfortunately, Solon was writing poetry as opposed to just writing down maybe a prose description of what he did. So it's a little bit more flowery, it's a little bit more embellishment, I guess, or imagery. But luckily, we have some later sources that kind of fill in some of the blanks for us and talk a little bit about what Solon did. Okay. So Solon enacts something called the Sesaktheia, which means the shaking off of the burdens. And this is related to a group of people who are called the Sixth Parters. And they were people who owed 1/6 of their profits, of their produce, to another. And our basic assumption is, right, how one becomes a six-parter, it doesn't say this explicitly, are people who go into debt, right? So you go into debt, you get help, you get a loan, whatever. In order to pay this off, you have to give 1/6 of your produce to someone else, right? Which again is not a good way to survive if you are barely getting by, right? Those who could not pay, right, or were on the brink of starvation, became what were called debt bondsmen. And this is different, again, slightly different than slavery. So debt bondage was theoretically, notice this word, theoretically, supposed to be a temporary condition where you worked off your debt through labor to your creditor, right? That you would perform labor for your creditor to work off your debt. In reality, again, it doesn't work. It's a way of keeping people in perpetual servitude.
It's called indentured servitude, right?
It can be. Here, so this is slightly different than when normally we think of indentured servitude, we're thinking of like U.S. colonial model. Slightly different, but similar type of idea of working off a debt.
Would it be worse?
It's worse because there was a vested interest in the colonial era of making sure that people were able to work off their debts, right? So indentured servitude was useful, and it was considered useful because people could actually finish their term. Here, although we know much less about this time, there wasn't really any incentive to help people get out of debt bondage, if that makes sense. And in fact, the incentive was to keep them in debt bondage, because what Solon appears to be referencing is that at some point, you could basically give up on the person and sell them into slavery outside of the city. So an Athenian citizen who is in debt, who for whatever reason was not successful in working off his debt, at some point the creditors were allowed to sell them into slavery. So Athenian citizens weren't supposed to be enslaved by other Athenians. They could be held in debt bondage, but at this point they could be, again, sold off to slavery somewhere else. All right, so now we go back to Breyer's question. What did Athenians think about certain types of slavery? So, to start off, Athenians did not have a problem with slavery as a system. They were perfectly happy to enslave other peoples and keep them in permanent bondage. There's no talk of abolishing slavery as an institution or that somehow slavery as an institution was morally problematic. Here, one second, we'll come back here. Okay. The Athenians initially didn't have a problem with debt bondage, so long as debt bondage was kept apart from slavery. That was less in terms of labor, right? That enslaved people in Athens weren't necessarily doing different types of jobs or even living different types of lives than non-enslaved people. But it was basically both the permanence and the status under the law, where an enslaved person was property with basically very limited personal rights. A debt bondsman was still technically an Athenian citizen. So the problem here is twofold. One, the number of people going into debt bondage was problematic because, again, you need citizens who make their own money so that they can buy their own weapons and armor so they can serve in the Athenian army. If many people are going into debt, they can't serve as hoplites, right? So you're kind of diminishing your citizen base, both in the army and otherwise. Problem number two is that this kind of loophole was being exploited, where Athenian citizens held in debt bondage were then being sold as slaves. And sure, technically they weren't being enslaved in Athens, but Solon's like, this is even worse, right? In a way, because they're being enslaved and they're being pushed away from their city, right? They're being disconnected from Athens, right? So, difference in status, but not necessarily difference in day-to-day life. But that difference in status was important, and here's when it hits its boiling point. Does that kind of answer the question? Is that good? All right, okay. So, what comes out of the Sesaktheia is Solon is going to cancel basically a bunch of these debts, these kind of 6-part debts, says you don't owe this anymore, don't have to work as debt bondsman, and in fact makes debt bondage now illegal. That you're no longer able to offer yourself as basically collateral for a loan. Okay? You look like you have a question.
Yeah, what do you offer them?
Well, that becomes tricky. So we're going to see the Athenian government take other steps to try to kind of address poverty. But that does become a tricky issue.
So does this slavery decline when Christianity rises?
We're way from there. Short answer is no, not at first. That'll come later. Basically, slavery doesn't decline, we're going to be completely honest and blunt, until it becomes less profitable. That in Rome and the successor kingdoms to Rome are going to continue slavery as long as they can until it becomes more profitable to switch to another system. All right, but that's later. Here, we're still way away from Christianity. And again, no moral, ethical problems with slavery as a whole, right? So the Athenians are like, well, we shouldn't enslave other Athenians. They'll kind of get to the point that maybe we shouldn't enslave other Greeks. But the concept of enslaving people, right, especially non-Athenians, not an issue. And again, same is true with the other Greek city-states as well. All right, so Solon outlaws debt bondage. Other things he does, he institutes a series of economic reforms, again designed to alleviate poverty. So he does some simple things like standardizing weights and measures. Also offers citizenship to kind of artisans who want to immigrate to Athens. He basically gives them full citizenship. He also invests in a new cash crop, right? He tries to get people to focus less on kind of just farming for yourself and your family, and devoting at least part of your attention to farming olive oil. The land in Attica is well suited for growing olives, right? And this is going to be a profitable crop that can be exported not just throughout Greece, because really lots of places in Greece are actually pretty good for olive oil, but more widely across the Mediterranean, right? So by switching over to kind of a cash crop is a way of kind of building up your economic base. Okay, questions here? Okay, fragment 13 of Solon is also really interesting, right? We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to kind of sum it up, Solon's like, yeah, I like money. Yeah, I want to be rich. I pray to the gods to be rich all the time, right? Remember, Solon is a wealthy aristocrat. He's one of these oligarchs. Solon has no problem with money and no problem with the rich being in charge, right? But his problem in 13, right, is he says, I am unwilling to possess it unjustly. The problem is when people act in an unjust manner to make money, right? But again, his version of justice doesn't necessarily line up with ours. It's okay to exploit people, you just can't exploit them in certain ways. Okay. All right, so the other reform, and this is going to have long-lasting constitutional implications, is he creates kind of a new constitution, a new way of organizing the Athenian state. And at the heart of this are 4 wealth classes. So basically, based on how much money and property you have, your family gets assigned into one of these 4 categories. At the top, the Pentakoisemidimnoi, which means the 500 bushel men. These were the richest of the Athenian citizens, right? Ostensibly because they had enough kind of property to produce 500 bushels of grain or olive oil in a year. Originally, it was only from this class that archons could be selected, right? So Solon puts this into place and says, this is our oligarchic class, right? Anyone can join, it's not restricted to certain families, so long as your family meets the wealth qualification. All right? Then, next level, we have the hippes, or the horsemen, or the knights, right? So at first, they were only eligible for kind of lesser offices, kind of the more bureaucratic positions. But down the road a bit, they too will be eligible to become archons. So a few decades after Solon, right, both the Pentakoisemidimnoi and the hippes are eligible to become archons, the executive officers of Athens. Anthony.
So they have to amplify their wealth to become
No.
archon? No.
Basically, they lower the limit from 500 to 300 to be an archon. But that's going to come later. At first, they're allowed to be like officials, but not the highest officials. All right. Next down, we have the Zeugites, the yokemen. So they were eligible for the Council of 400. And then all these people are eligible for it too, which would be a group of 400 people, 100 selected from each of the 4 tribes, right? And their job was to set the agenda for the assembly. They would decide what the assembly would talk about and what it would vote on. This seems to be kind of the cutoff, 200 bushels, for those who could serve as hoplites. Meaning that these were the people that had enough money to pay for their own weapons and armor and serve in the Athenian army. Anyone below was a Thete. They were a citizen, but their kind of participatory rights were very, very limited. They were allowed to attend the assembly, the meeting of citizens. We're not sure if they were allowed to speak at it or not, or we're not sure if they were allowed to vote at it, right? So again, your kind of ability to participate in the Athenian government was based on wealth. All right, questions? No, all right. Okay, so this brings us then to Pisistratus and tyranny. The reforms of Solon seem to help, but don't fix everything. There's still a lot of kind of unrest in Athens and what appears to be economic anxiety. Athens is going to break up into 3 factions, Lycurgus and the men of the plain, Megacles and the men of the coast. That's a familiar name. Oh yes, Megacles is a member of the Alcmaeonid family. One of other Solon's reforms is that all exiled Athenians, right, and those who had been sold into slavery and maybe possibly became free, could come back to Athens. So the Alcmaeonids will make their triumphant return. Remember, this is the cursed family from the episode of Cylon. All right? And lastly, Pisistratus and the men of the hill. Pisistratus gets it in his mind, and this is the reading from PS 8, primary source 8, right from Herodotus, where we get the story of Pisistratus, that he is going to take advantage of the situation and make himself tyrant. And it's going to be a long road for Pisistratus to become tyrant. 561, he seizes power. He's able to get enough support from his faction. He's only able to hold on to it for a year until Lycurgus and Megacles team up and kick him out. So then he goes away for about 6 years. At which point he then makes an alliance with Megacles. Says, tell you what, you support me at becoming tyrant, I'll marry your daughter. And then our children will succeed us. Megacles says, okay. So Pisistratus returns to power as a tyrant. However, Pisistratus already has children and decides he doesn't want any more, that's just going to screw things up. So he refuses to have children with Megacles' daughter. Or at least so the story goes. Alliance breaks, and Pisistratus is driven out of the city once again. Right? It's this event where we get the story of Athena, or we should say Athena, returning Pisistratus to the city, right? Where they find a very tall, beautiful woman by the name of Phae. They dress her up like Athena, right? And they put her in a chariot, and she leads Pisistratus back to the city. And they tell everyone, look, the goddess Athena has brought him back to rule, which we get this kind of crazy talk here, which I will read here. This is kind of very illuminating on Athenian attitudes at the time. It might be useful if you are working on the essay on Panhellenism, right? So, he says at the very bottom of page 2, Pisistratus and Megacles make this agreement, and then here is the device on which they hit. It was the silliest that I find on record. More especially considering that the Greeks have been from very ancient times distinguished from barbarians. Non-Greeks, right? Everyone who wasn't Greek was a barbarian. By superior sagacity, right? Superior wisdom and freedom from foolish simpleness, right? So he's like, this is crazy, because what are the Greeks known for? What's that? Philosophers, but what is Herodotus saying here?
Logic.
Logic compared to
Barbarians.
barbarians. Who are barbarians?
Non-Greek.
Everyone else. So he's like, from time immemorial, we Greeks, Herodotus is saying, are famous for our wisdom, the fact that we are smarter than everyone else. So I can't believe this crazy foolishness that happened here, right? And remembering that the people, or the persons on whom this trick was played, were not only the Greeks, but the Athenians, who have the credit of surpassing all other Greeks in cleverness. That they fell for this stupid trick, thinking that Pisistratus was being brought back by Athena, right? But it tells us something about the Greek kind of chauvinism here, right? How they viewed themselves compared to others. Anyway, this falls apart. Pisistratus goes away for another 5 years, comes back, or another 9 years, comes back, is able to seize power again, and now will rule Athens as tyrant for about 20 years. His 2 adult sons, right, ones he had prior to this, right, they will then succeed him, and in theory take his place after he dies. All right, so real quickly, just finish up Athens under Pisistratus. Okay, Pisistratus, and here again when we go back to tyrant being kind of a neutral term, will actually prove to be a relatively popular Athenian leader. All right, so remember, how does someone seize power as tyrant? What do they need?
Popular support.
Popular support. And popular support by whom?
But they need support from other tyrants.
Okay, it can be other tyrants, and he'll get support from other tyrants too. But you also need, Jordan?
The aristocrats.
Maybe you can maybe get by without the elite aristocrats. It's hard, but who do you need? Right?
The common people.
The common people meaning who? I heard someone say something, I think. Who do you need? You need the poor people. They're pretty easy get. Who else do you need? Who did Cylon not get?
Oh, the middle class?
The middle class, kind of the hoplites, right? All of these people that are rich enough to perform, to buy their arms and armor, who are willing to kind of serve in, or who can serve in the army, but who might be a little unhappy because, these people hold all the offices, right? You need kind of, middle class isn't quite right, but it makes sense, right? You need kind of middling people to support you as well, right? Pisistratus is able to get a critical number of people to support him become tyrant. All right, so he continues Solon's economic policies, right? So he invests in and encourages long-distance trade, not just olive oil, right? But Athens developing its own unique form of pottery. So we saw this back a couple classes ago when we were talking about archaic era pottery, right? This is called red figure pottery, where you kind of etch in the design after lacquering the pot with black, right? So remember, Solon was offering citizen status to anyone who would immigrate to Athens, right? They were trying to attract artisans, including potters. Pisistratus is going to continue this and basically help create a massive pottery industry, right? Athens, under his reign, is going to turn into an economic powerhouse, one of the richest and most kind of economically vibrant of the Greek city-states. He invests in major public building projects, right? This is going to basically create lots of work opportunities for poor Athenian citizens. It also will turn Athens into a major cultural center, right? He also institutes new civic festivals, helping to kind of rebuild Athenian unity and promote this kind of new vision for Athens as a cultural center, right? So much of what we kind of think of as being classical Greek culture is really kind of Athenian culture, right? And it has its origins in Pisistratus's programs here. Okay, we'll talk about this on Wednesday. All right, any last questions, comments here?